Hello, everybody. Today I have the pleasure to have a conversation with Mr. Mark Weber. Mr. Weber is the director of the Institute for Historical Review. He owns a master degree in history. Now, if I have to make a disclaimer. If you search on Google for the IHR, Institute for Historical Review, you're not going to find it directly. You will be redirected to site like the Anti-Defamation League. I even saw Auschwitz something because there's some controversy about this institute regarding something that me in Canada I don't have the right to talk about, but for me, I believe in free speech, and it's important for me that people like them, which I admire, and they offer a lot of good things for us to learn. I think it's important that we give them the full right to speech. So my goal, as I told you last time with this interview, is to bring the most argument possible in order to debunk the myth about World War II. My three main reasons remain the same. I think that World War II is used to justify, but is still used today, and it has been used since 1945 to justify a lot of unnecessary imperialist war. And now today we are at the risk of a war with Russia that could mean the end of humanity. So I think it's very important. But as a libertarian, I also think that by debunking World War II, we can make a point against the intervention of the state. And like a lot of people that hate the woke, the postmodernist and cultural Marxist and identity politics, a lot of that movement, I think, rests on the World War II myth. The idea that all the evils of World War II were done because the Nazis were racist is totally false. As I said, most of the woke people, they would have no problem to put you or me in a concentration camps for our view. So the idea that Nazi Germany was evil because of reason of identity politics is totally, I think, stupid. If governments are evil because the way they act, they are all like that. So the woke ideology that is a cancer to our society, I believe that once we debunk World War II, they will lose most of their effect. So, Mr. Weber, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is there something when I introduce you, because as I said before recording, I'm a total amateur in that. Is there something when I presented you that is incomplete, false, or that you would like to add?
No, nothing you said was false. You made a very good point at the beginning. If you look up Institute for Historical Review, the algorithms of Google and of YouTube and so forth have been changed to deliberately distort not only what we stand for, what we try to do, but they deliberately put up things from the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center,
yeah, they were
so
there.
and I always think that's really childish, because if you want to know what someone believes, even if you don't like it, whether it's Christianity or Islam or communism, you should find out what communists or Muslims or Christians have to say.
Yeah.
You don't learn about the Ku Klux Klan by going to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you don't learn about the Martin Luther King by going to the Ku Klux Klan or something. I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious, but they deliberately misrepresent, really, very egregiously, what we do, what I try to do, and so forth. And so anyway, that's a good place to start, because this is part really of this kind of distortion of history, and the centerpiece of it really is the Second World War. I was just astonished that during the past election campaign, you heard both Donald Trump and Harris and Biden called the others fascists. I mean,
Yeah.
this is another word that already in 1946 or 1947, George Orwell says the word fascist has lost all meaning, except he's a bad person. He's bad. People throw this word around knowing nothing about where the term or ideology comes from, or who believed it, or why, or whatever. It's just thrown around in this way. And I was also struck that during this election campaign, I don't know how many times Donald Trump was compared to Hitler. And we've heard this comparison made repeatedly over the years. I mean, already I remember Saddam Hussein, he's Hitler, he's a new Hitler. Hillary Clinton, she said Vladimir Putin is a new Hitler. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin, he says the Ukrainians are Nazis, you see, and they're like this. Yeah. This is really pretty silly. 80 years after the end of the war, that the one historical figure who was talked about more than any other during the recent presidential campaign is Hitler, for heaven's sake. It's not George Washington or Lincoln or Winston Churchill, it's Hitler. And now, again, done in this rather silly way. And I agree with you very much about the importance of, you might say, tearing away the icon of the Second World War in the way that's used. And even when I was very young about the Vietnam War, you heard Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and other politicians say, you see, we have to go to war in Vietnam because the communists will take over. And it's just like Munich in 1938. It's just like Hitler. We have to stop them in the communists in South Vietnam. If we don't, then they will take over Laos and Thailand. Then they'll be in Malaysia. And then they'll be taking over Hawaii. And even as a child, I thought that's pretty far-fetched. But you hear these kinds of arguments made all the time. And again, well, you've read some of the things I've written on this subject. I try to put this all really in an essay that I worked on, and it's on our website, called The Good War Myth of World War II. I think this
I encourage people to read when I will put the video on YouTube. I will put a link to this. It's a very great thesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, my big point is how this so-called lessons of World War II are cited by politicians in the United States, especially, but also in Russia too, because they were the winners in World War II as well. They were the good guys.
Oh, yes.
And they say, oh, yeah, we're the bad guys. So anybody who disagrees with our view, they're the bad guys, you see. And so that's why they say, oh, the Ukrainians, you see, are Nazis. And so that's why we have to stop them. This is really dangerous because it's used as a pretext for wars that everyone, I think, later agrees were pretty stupid. Almost everyone in America agrees that the Iraq War was a fiasco. It was based on lies.
Now they agree, but I'm 49 years old, and I started to be politicized after 9/11. And I remember when I went for my first demonstration in 2003 in Montreal, but the people around me and my friends, my family, and where I work, a lot of people were against me and believed that the war was justified. Like now today, I think 99%, 95% of people agree it was a mistake.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah. Me today, the main topic that I want you to talk, so I will give you I will give you all the time you want. Is I want you to tell us why you think, like me, that World War II was not a good war, like we are told by the mainstream media, the court historian, the politician, and especially the Hollywood movies. So, Mr. Weber, please go on and tell us why World War II was not a good war.
Well, the most obvious reason is because even by the standards that everyone sort of agrees upon, there were countries on both sides that were not nice countries. I'll put it that way mildly. Agreed. America's most important allies in the Second World War was the British Empire and the Soviet Union. Now, and I make the obvious point, it should be obvious to anyone. The British Empire in 1939 was the largest empire in world history. The British Empire held hundreds of millions of people against their will, it held them in bondage, or
Exactly.
they were colonial power.
Yeah.
I mean, most notably, what is now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It was all part of British India. But of course, Nigeria, Malaysia, Uganda, South Africa, all these countries were part of the British Empire. And when Winston Churchill became prime minister in 1940, he said explicitly, we're fighting for the British Empire, he said. And this is very important. Well, this is imperialism. And Winston Churchill was a tremendous defender of imperialism. Now, I mean, I'm not want to get an argument about the British Empire is good or bad, but it should be kept in mind that, of course, that's what. And then, of course, the most important military ally of the United States during the Second World War was the Soviet Union, by far. And when the Russian government today or other people who talk about World War II point out that the great sacrifice in the war, the most important military power subduing Germany, was not the United States, it was the Soviet Union. That's a fact. And no historian really disagrees with that. But the public is given the impression, especially by Hollywood movies, by our politicians and so forth, that the United States was really the decisive power. Well, I mean, we could say decisive, but the Soviet Union was really by far the most important military. Something like 70–80% of all German forces in the war were destroyed on the Eastern Front. The United States motion pictures like Saving Private Ryan or The Longest Day, they emphasize the importance of D-Day. Now, D-Day was important. This was in June 1944, the invasion of northern France by American British forces, and it was important. But this invasion took place less than a year before the war was over. By that time already, the tide of battle had shifted very, very much against the Germans. Already by 1944, the British and the Americans had marked air superiority, military air superiority over France and over Germany. And the great decisive battles on the Eastern Front of Stalingrad and Kursk had already been lost by Germany. Already, Army Group Center in 1944 had been destroyed by the Soviets. The Soviets were, I mean, this is known to really all specialists. They know this. But the American public is giving this idea that America, we're the great one. The Soviets, well, yeah, they played a role. But the scope and the scale of the Soviet role in the war is not really acknowledged. And the reason is, of course, because after the war was over, then the United States said, oh, the Soviet Union's bad, because the only thing that kept the alliance of the Soviet Union and the United States during the war was they were both trying to destroy, especially Germany, and Germany's allies too. But anyway, destroyed Hitler's Germany. That was the big goal. Once that was eliminated, then, of course, the rivalry that had existed before the war reemerged, and the Soviet Union and the United States became enemies, or at least rivals, during this entire Cold War period. And so the United States was embarrassed about its wartime alliance with the Soviet Union. It's important to remember that during the war, the United States praised the Soviet Union and Stalin as a worthy partner in building what they called a new world order. They were going to have a new world in which never again would there be oppression or war or conflict. This was Roosevelt's promise over and over that after the war was over. In fact, I quote, and you can find it in even published documents by the U.S. government, Roosevelt was explicit. After the war was over, the United States and the Soviet Union and maybe Britain and China were going to be the only countries with military forces. The rest of the world would be forcibly disarmed to create this new world. Now, of course, that was very embarrassing after the war because the Soviet Union was, by any objective standard, the most oppressive regime of the time. I mean, yes, okay, you could say Hitler's Germany was oppressive, you could say all that, but the Soviet Union was far, far more oppressive than Hitler's Germany. And I don't want to get into, it's not a good guy, bad guy, it's only the point that the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. So the most important thing is, it's not the good guys and bad guys. There were bad guys on both sides. And there were, I mean, one ally of Germany during the Second World War was Finland. Finland was probably, well, certainly a more progressive country than the United States or Britain was. The Finnish government was a leftist liberal government. It was very democratic. Women could vote in Finland, but they couldn't vote in France until after World War II, for example. I mean, I could go on about that, and the governments, whatever you say, on both sides, there were oppressive governments, there were more free governments that were more or less representative of its people. But anyway, that's the big point. Now, for America, this notion, though, that we're the good guys is very, very strong, especially in the United States. And the reason for that is because the United States, especially from World War to the present, has justified itself not on cultural or ethnic or racial or religious grounds, but by the idea that we're for progress. We're the good guys. It's an ideological society. Yes. And the Soviet Union also justified its enormous empire. I mean, the Soviet Empire, even under Stalin, had all these, nearly half the population of the Soviet Union was not Russian. And they had many, many people, of course, were held in the Soviet Union on the basis that, well, this is the march of time. We're in keeping with the trends, and this is inevitable, and the whole world will one day be kind of one country. Nationalism isn't really important. And so for this, and to that extent, the United States and the Soviet Union both shared this view. They see that we're the good guys. We represent the kind of the path of the future, the vision of the future. Anyway, this is the basic reason why the war was not just a one between good guys and bad guys. Now, there's many other examples of that I could point out beyond that. One of them is after the war was over, the United States and the Soviet Union, along with Britain and France, put the German leaders on trial and executed the most important of them because they did terrible things. But they were executed for reasons that, if applied to the Allied leaders, would have meant the death of American leaders. I mean, this is obvious. They said, well, let's see, Germany, they made war. They attacked Poland in 1939. That's true. Although in 1940, 1939, it was the British and the French that declared war on Germany, not the other way around. People forget about that. And
I always point to people, Britain and France had invaded and occupied a quarter of the landmass of the planet, hundreds of millions of people under colonialism. They didn't have the moral high ground to declare war on Germany because Germany violated Poland's sovereignty. So go on.
Yes, well, that's another thing. I mean, Britain and France declared war on Germany in 1939. The pretext, the reason they gave for declaring war was, oh, Germany has violated Poland's sovereignty and its independence. That's true. Well, several weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland. Yeah. And even at the time, people ask British leaders, well, why aren't you declaring war on the Soviet Union? And they gave some evasive thing. It's not well known, but the guarantee to Poland to go to war on behalf of Poland if it's invaded had a secret clause. And the clause said, this applies only to Germany. It doesn't apply to any other country.
I didn't.
It's not well known. That's not well known. No. But the point is, in fact, it did apply. So the Soviet Union, actually, of the territory of the Polish Republic, the Soviets took more than Germany did.
Yeah, like 60% versus 40%.
Something like that, yes. Yeah. But the point is, and then the real tragedy of the war, that is after 5.5 years of war, at the end of the war, Poland was not free. Oh. And the British, of course, at the end of the war, were in this very embarrassing situation because they went along with Stalin, of recognizing a government in Warsaw that Stalin had installed. It was a pro-communist government, and the government that the British had supported in 1939, the British turned its back on. And Poland, of course, was just turned over to the Soviets. And it's an embarrassment. And I also quote in my essay how in the 6-volume history of the Second World War by Stalin, at the very beginning.
Churchill?
By Churchill. Churchill's 6-volume history of the Second World War. Churchill even says at the very beginning, at the introduction, he says, well, the war is really a tremendous tragedy. It's a tragedy because at the end of this war, he says, we're confronted by a greater threat than we did in 1939, meaning the Soviet Union. Well, Okay, so you ask yourself, especially on the results of the war, you see why is it justified? Now, the way it's justified, usually in America and Britain and so other countries, is well, Hitler was so bad that we had to fight against him, and we're the good guys, he's the bad guy, and so it says war should be fought on the basis of who's the good guys. This is a very dangerous thing because uh, human beings are not like that. There aren't good guys and bad guys in life. There's good people that do some good things, some bad things. That's the nature of human beings, and so that's why this is dangerous because it's used as a justification for other wars, always framed in that sort of way, and it's flattering because it tells the public we're all good guys, aren't we? And everybody says yes. Well, that sounds good. And then, well, I often say it's the United States is a little bit has a kind of Superman mentality. What I mean by that is in the Superman comics or in the Superman movies, Superman only proves he's a good guy when he's fighting bad guys. If he's not fighting bad guys, he's just Clark Kent. He's just this ordinary person.
Yeah.
So it sort of tells people, well, you can prove you're good by fighting bad guys. And so there's this desperate effort on the part of many American leaders always to frame the United States as a parallel to the so-called good war of World War II. Now, there's many other specifics I could say about the Second World War, but that's just the basic reason why it's simplistic and inaccurate and wrong and therefore dangerous to frame it in terms of good guys and bad guys, evil versus good in that way.
You can go on.
I can go on. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just answering that basic question.
Okay.
That's right. I mean, another way to put it is there's bad. I don't know of a purely good war in all of human history. Maybe a defensive war that's you could maybe justify that. But the modern wars are not like that. I'll put it another way. The United States, of course, and Americans pride themselves on we're for peace. We want peace. Well, almost everybody in every country wants peace. I mean, the public in every country says we want peace. But no country in modern times has attacked, bombed, invaded, occupied more countries in the world than the United States of America. I mean, the United States has, and today the United States is the only country with a military and a naval force, not just a big one, but by far the biggest one. We
like
have
700 military base.
Yeah, military bases all over the world, and a naval force in the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. The United States says this is absolutely necessary. Well, I think it's pretty obviously not necessary, given that China doesn't seem to need anything like a military this large. The United States military is well, it used to be said it's larger than the rest of the world of combined. Now people say, well, it's certainly larger than the next 5 countries combined. It's far greater than the military of Russia or Iran, who are considered big threats to the United States. So it justifies not only going to war, but this enormous expense in military power. I remember when the Cold War came down, many conservatives would say, well, good, okay, now the justification for having this big military is gone. I mean, supposedly the military was necessary because the Soviet Union was this great threat. Well, the Soviet Union not only collapsed, but the Soviet forces withdrew from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, from Eastern Europe, and then even the Soviet Union itself fell apart, and so there even the Balkan states, Central Asia, that was all gone. And so many conservatives at the time who had supported the Cold War because they were very anti-communist said, well, now that communism is really sort of gone, we can dismantle this enormous military. Billions and billions of dollars that we've used for for war or preparation for war can be used for better purposes, or just let the people have the money. I mean, that's even a nicer thing, perhaps.
Yes.
But instead, they began coming up with new justifications for the war, new justifications for the military. There's new reasons to it. It's one of the reasons why I am particularly angered by all of the talk in America about how important it is for the United States to go to war for Ukraine. The reason I'm angry is because during the Second World War, the United States thought it was just fine if the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and controlled by Stalin. If anybody in World War II had talked about Ukrainian freedom or Ukrainian independence, they would have been considered a person wrecking the American war effort. And even during the Cold War, nobody even talked, except tiny little voices, about Ukraine. Nobody cared about Ukraine. And so now, to make Ukrainian independence or sovereignty an issue for war seems just utterly hypocritical and silly, considering how unimportant it was during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s for all those years. And the United States didn't care at all. And so, but people who want war can always find new pretexts or justifications for going to war. And after the thing is over, people wonder and scratch their head and wondered, why did we do that? Again, I was very influenced when I was very young by the Vietnam War. And generally, the American public accepted, until many, many Americans began dying, of the reasons given for the Vietnam War.
Were you forced? Were you drafted?
I was exempt because my lottery number was very high, and so I was out. By the time it came up for me, it was a lottery system based on your birthday, and so I got this very high lottery number. But I was opposed. I didn't want to serve. I thought even then, I didn't think it out all that clearly, but it seemed to me really stupid. Now, the reason I bring it up, though, is that the irony is that after the communists, quote unquote, won in Vietnam, a year later, Vietnam and China went to war against each other. In other words, this idea that the communist world is this big monolithic power was not true even then, even at that time. The Vietnamese War was not just a war of communists. It was really far more, I think, a national struggle by Vietnamese who didn't want foreigners running their country, whether they're Americans, Japanese, the French. They wanted Vietnam to be an independent country. But to go to the present, the really unusual thing is now, even though the government of Vietnam is still the same communist party that was in power during the Vietnam War in the North, is now an ally, or at least on very friendly relations with the United States. You go to any big American store and you'll find many, many products made in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And now, in fact, Vietnam has begun even importing automobiles made in Vietnam to the United States. My point is that after it's all over, you think, well, what was the whole point then? I mean, if at the end of the day now we're on friendly and amicable terms with that country, why we ever fight in the first place? But you see, people have forgotten all about that. They just sort of ignore all of that. But these kind of points that I'm making are more or less much more accepted now by younger Americans. Younger Americans have they're much less impressed by the justifications given by our leaders. Mm-hmm. When I grew up, it was just taken for granted that the United States had to support Israel in whatever it did. Oh, yeah. But now polls show that younger people, especially, think, well, no, that's not good. Israel's doing bad things. Why we've got all these problems here in this country. Why should we be giving all this military and economic aid and so forth to Israel? I don't want to get off the track about Israel. It's just that younger people, especially now, have become so jaded, so skeptical of official proclamations on almost everything, that they tend to be very skeptical now of U.S. pretexts or justifications for wars in any country, including even in Ukraine.
You're aware that I think there was a turning point about World War II in last September when Tucker Carlson interviewed Daryl Cooper. Have you heard about that?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Me, I was amazed when I saw Tucker Carlson on my YouTube feed, and Churchill, main villain of World War II. Wow, this is major. This is huge, and the reaction we got after that. But I had a conversation with Scott Horton, the director of antiwar.com, and Scott Horton had a chat also with Daryl Cooper and other libertarian like Dave Smith. But the fact that Tucker Carlson let him say and show some interest and let him talk to why Winston Churchill was the main villain of World War II, it's a major turning point. And of course, there was a reaction. The court historian, I think the White House was totally mad about this. But for me, I was, wow, this is great. And now, well, if I can ask you a specific question, I guess we're both revisionists of the Second World War, but in your life, was there something that helped you become a revisionist of the Second World War? As I like to say, for me, when I was 10 years old, there was the movie Gandhi. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the movie Gandhi, there's a scene where the British Army shoot at a mass of unarmed Indians, women, and children. Look, I was 10 years old watching that. That's horrifying. British soldier with their rifle, and you see the blood, the baby, the children crying. And that was the movie that everybody wanted to see in 1984, 1995. That was awful to watch that scene. And a few years later, I got my first course of history in government. And of course, they talk about World War II, the good guy and the evil German, and the good guy. And then in my brain, wait, the good guy you talked to me about are the one that shot women and children in the movie that everybody watched. So already I had some questioning. Me, that was really the scene in the movie Gandhi that was like the spark. Of course, I had to learn a lot more until I became openly a revisionist, because when I became politicized, I was a Marxist, because as I told you earlier, when I went to the first demonstration against the Iraq war in 2003, everybody there were leftist. There were no alternative to left, like libertarian or a paleo-conservative that could be anti-war too. So I became a Marxist. I was pretty anti-war, but I thought that World War II was the exception, because I believed that Nazi Germany was were so evil and that they were going to conquer the world. So now I know it's not true today. But for you, Mark, was there something, an event that made you become a revisionist?
Well, when I was very young, I had arguments with my parents, with other people about the Vietnam War. And I remember even then, I would say, well, this war isn't really justified. And people would say, well, are you saying America's wrong when it goes to war? And I said, well, I didn't know what to say. And then they said, well, of course, in World War II. And even then I thought, well, yeah, I guess maybe that's yeah, okay, I can see that, and so forth, because that's the way it was presented. But I mean, I just had the standard view of everybody else on that war. My interest in history was really, I think, very much sparked by my father. He served in World War II as an officer in the Marine Corps. The first foreign country he visited was China. And he was stationed in China right after the Second World War as a young man. And he talked a lot about that. That had a big influence on him because, as I said, it's the first foreign country he ever really visited. And so he talked about conditions there. And it was very obvious from what my father said, and what you can read later, is that the Chiang Kai-shek government, which was America's big ally in the war, was a very corrupt, very inept, bad government. And he was not surprised. Nobody was really surprised when the whole thing fell apart and Mao Zedong and the communists took control of China. But already that's a kind of revisionism, because during World War II, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Republic and so forth, they were considered this great ally of the United States. Well, he was a dictator, certainly in the same way that the Mao Zedong or other dictatorships were. But that's not how it was presented. In fact, in World War II, American propaganda emphasized this idea that there's the slave world and the free world. And the slave world is everybody opposed to the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is part of the free world. China is part of the free world, but Germany and Finland and Romania, they're part of this slave world. And so it's very simplistic, of course, but that was accepted. People thought, well, it looks impressive, and the propaganda was very strong. But anyway, that was one thing. The other thing, too, when I was in high school, I was very involved in a campaign to raise money for people in Biafra. There was a big starvation in southeast Nigeria today. I mean, I don't want to get into the details about that, but I went to Europe as a young man, and I was directed to a Biafra aid organization in Germany. Now, it was only a coincidence. I could have go to a group in France or in Belgium or in Switzerland, some other country, but I went to Germany. And I was very curious talking to people, and it was very clear, very quickly, that the Second World War is looked at very differently not just in Germany, but in Poland or France, very differently in the United States. And the big reason, I think, for that is that in America, wars that America is involved in take place far away. They're overseas. Americans don't see the consequences or feel the consequences of war in the way Japanese or Russians or Chinese or Poles do. War is something far away, and win or lose, American soldiers come back home and life just more or less continues as it has been. In Europe, everyone, in France and Belgium, I talked to people in Belgium, I worked in Belgium briefly, in France, everyone has war means bombs, it means privation, it means soldiers are marching around, bad things happen. Mm-hmm. And especially the further east you go, really bad things happen. Of course, in Japan and China, really bad things happen. Americans talk very loosely, very easily about going to war. When I was a boy, I remember people would say, you hear people just say, well, if the Russians cause too much trouble, we'll just bomb Moscow. We'll just drop atomic bombs on them. See, Americans can talk like that because we haven't had the privation and the misery and the sacrifice, the suffering of war in the way other countries have. And out of the Second World War, during the Second World War, America, the economy was, except for the poor people getting shot or killed, America was prosperous during the Second World War. And after the Second World War, America was the only country emerging from the war with a big industrial plant in place. The rest of the world had been destroyed. The rest of the world had been put on its back. Not only in Europe, but in Asia, everywhere. It was ruined. So the United States was top dog. It was top of the world after the Second World War and up until maybe the 70s or 80s, something like that, until the time of the Cold War ending. The United States was preeminent financially, economically, militarily. Yeah, the Soviet Union had a military force, but it wasn't any kind of cultural or even economic adversary, threat to the United States or rival. Yeah. Nobody in the world bought Soviet-made products, for example. Nobody bought Soviet radios or cars or anything like that. They could barely.
They had line up, and I think years. They had to wait years to buy a car with a cardboard doors. So yeah.
Well, of course. I mean, yeah. And I visited, even as a young man, I visited East Germany. And I mean, it was obvious. I mean, the thing is all kind of very, very poor quality, very, very shoddy, really. And everybody knew this. And also, Soviet Union was very unattractive to people in the world who had any religious sensibilities. And it was also, I mean, there's many other problems. But the point is, the United States was preeminent. And Americans of my generation and older, they think that's the norm. The United States should be on top of the world. You hear this, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are older than I am, but each of them has this idea that the America of their youth is the normal way it should be. We're on top of the world. And they think that that's because we're good, we're great, we've got this great constitution, or whatever reasons they want to give. It's really objectively because the United States came out of the war as the only country intact, and we were on top. And the world has changed, and many people, especially older Americans, don't really grasp just how much the world has changed. Right after World War II, 90-some% of the cars made in the world were made by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler in Detroit. Yeah. Today, every day, China makes more cars every day than Japan and the United States combined. And Americans don't really sort of get that. They do know, of course, that now on our roads are all these cars with Toyotas, and they have Japanese names or Korean names or German names. They do realize that's certainly changed. When I was a boy, the only foreign, you didn't see foreign cars. The first foreign cars were these little Volkswagen Beetles, and they were very popular, but they were considered kind of comic, kind of funny. They were odd-looking cars, but they were popular. I mean, they were very cool. But the point is, they were an odd thing. But anyway, the world has changed. It's changed radically, and older people especially, and you'll still see in the U.S. Congress people echoing this idea that if only we can be like the way we were in 1960 when Kennedy was president or Johnson was president. They want to go back to that. And even the campaign recently of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he explicitly harkens back to how everything was great when his father and uncle were in the White House, were running things. And if we can just turn back the clock to that, and that's the motto of the Trump administration, make America great again, with this vague idea that, well, if we can make it the way it was back in the 1960s when the United States shouted, people obeyed. America just had so much leverage and power. Well, all that's changed. And that's why talking about the myth of World War II is really bringing, you might say, not only history in accord with reality or our perception of history, it's bringing the world, America, into reality with the world, you might say, because this Second World War mythology plays such a role in maintaining a kind of artificial place of America in the world. That's why this is one of the reasons why this is really important. In other words, it's not just we're talking about revising the history of the War of the Roses or the English Civil War or something like that. We're talking about a chapter of history that plays a very important role in people's mentality and how they look at things and policy in our time. And anyway, that's very important. And again, it's not just in the United States. Russia or the Soviet Union also had this view that the Second World War vindicated their way of life, the Soviet way of life, in the way that Americans like to think the Second World War vindicated America's way of doing things. And now the Soviet Union has fallen apart, and I dare say the United States is going through a crisis similar to the Soviet Union.
All Western country. I mean, in Canada, we still. I know you're in California. The homeless crisis is heartbreaking, but here too, after in Quebec, we got locked down during the COVID. That I often work on evening shift, and there was a curfew that my employer gave me a paper that I had to show to the police because I could be arrested if I was out of my home after 10 p.m. That's crazy. And the level of debt, the cost of housing here, I know it's but when you understand, I think, some basic economic and the money printing and the costs of war and a huge welfare program. So.
Yes, well, and especially this awareness is especially true of younger people. Younger people are, especially if younger people travel around. It doesn't take a genius to see all this. You mentioned earlier Tucker Carlson. And of course, I saw the interview he did with Daryl Cooper, and I've seen, of course, other interviews he does. And he's sort of refreshing in that he says repeatedly, I don't understand what happened. I'm trying to make sense of what's going on. And he said, how come Singapore or Moscow are nicer cities than Chicago or Los Angeles? How come we supposedly won and other cities are nicer and better than
Yeah.
our cities. What happened? And again, I with Daryl Cooper, he's just sort of fascinated that there's these different perspectives because he's trying to understand if we won. He said that even in the interview with Daryl Cooper. If we were the winners in World War II, what happened? What went wrong? And they're trying to make sense of this. This is a question that, in one way or the other, millions of Americans are asking because they don't understand how we went from here to there, how we fell. And especially, as I say, younger people, they are far more cynical, if you will, distrustful, skeptical about the narrative of the past. In fact, many of them, World War II is so far back in the past, they don't really even care. The attention span seems to be shorter than ever. But anyway, my point is that Tucker Carlson, I think, is sort of refreshing because it's not that he's dogmatic. He's more just perplexed and open to hearing all of this. And more and more people are. And it's one of the reasons why what you and I are talking about today resonates much more with younger people than with older people. And the older consensus is really breaking down, I think, rather dramatically.
It's funny because when I made my first YouTube video entitled "Why World War II Was Not a Good War," I was approached by a German man, and I can salute him, Mr. Hans, because he will listen to this, I'm sure. But I was approached by a German man who was 4 years old when the Royal Air Force bombed his home in Hamburg, and he thanked me. Said, hey, he appreciated that I offered a new view of World War II without praising the Nazi, because he told me that most people hated the Nazi, but they didn't like to be bombed and destroyed like they were. So for me, if I have a little goal if I can have a legacy that I would leave to the world, I would like to help change the mentality about World War II, especially in order to that war may stop, that imperialism and useless war have to stop. I would like to ask you two more questions. One maybe a little bit more challenging, but I would like you to tell me what is your opinion about National Socialist and Adolf Hitler? What do you think about that? If you want to, if you're not comfortable, no problem. But because I listened to some reading you made, you and David Irving, and you go into, yes, maybe controversial stuff, but I find that fascinating, and I would like to hear about that.
When some years ago, I was interviewed by George Will, who is a well-known columnist for the Washington Post, and his column was syndicated. And we met for lunch. He came to Orange County here, and we went to lunch. And he was asking me questions and trying to get me to say something provocative. But finally, in a kind of frustration, he said, well, what do you think about Hitler? And I find that that's the question people ask if you want to know what their kind of view is. I mean, Hitler to me is, first of all, he's, along with World War II, very much misrepresented. I
agree.
I'm very impressed now that more and more books are being published, which are far more objective than ones that appeared 20 years ago, or certainly when I was a boy. And I mean, there's so many examples of that, and also now because of the internet, people can see a lot more and learn a lot more on their own, in which it was not possible when I was young. I mean, I try to stress Hitler is part of history, and I think people can learn from that experience, not just in a negative way, but also in a positive way. I don't want to go into detail about that, but the big thing when people say, well, Hitler's evil, Hitler was really bad because he killed Jews in the Holocaust. That's the big thing. Well, even if one grants that and stipulates that, I mean, just accepts that, it's important to recognize that didn't start until the war, really. I mean, this was during the war. And this is a point Pat Buchanan makes in his book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. Yes, well, we sell this book. It's a very good book. He makes the point, and he makes the point in other places that, well, when did Hitler become evil? Was he evil already before World War II, before the Holocaust, or did he become evil? My point is that if the war had not certainly gone on the way it did, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree.
And I think most historians would grant that. But my big point is one of the things I've been very interested in about the Third Reich is the little known or little acknowledged reality that of all the major countries in the world at that time, Hitler's Germany was able to deal with the problem of unemployment in the Great Depression, the world economic crisis, much more ably and than any other big country. I mean, it was an astonishing achievement. And I've written essays much on this subject as well. And I think that should be learned from because we have, of course, continuing problems with economics and so forth. And I think a great deal can be learned from that. I'm much more interested in people just learning from these experiences. If I can contrast an interesting thing is that for many conservatives, even some libertarians, the big hero of the Second World War is Winston Churchill. They don't like.
It's not my case.
Not your case, no, not really so much his libertarians, but conservatives, because they don't like Stalin, they don't like Roosevelt very much. They certainly don't like Hitler, and so. But the irony is today Churchill is in rather bad reputation, not because of World War II, although I think that's important, but because they say, oh, he was a racist. Well, that's true too, but that was kind of the least important aspect, I think, of why Churchill, what he was like and so forth. But again, every age, every era imposes its own standards of right and wrong on the past. And so anybody who's a racist now, that's really bad. So that makes Churchill bad, even though his, I think, harmful influence was not so much because he was a racist.
That's why I said that at the beginning that the myth of World War II is essential to all the woke bullshit that we're facing, as if I'm not promoting racism, but people have to recognize that the difference because in a free world we have the right, we have the freedom of association, and thing in the U.S. like I know it's a big thing, but libertarians that are consistent will recognize that the civil rights movement of 1965. Unfortunately, were an attack on freedom of association. And I'm not promoting people to be racist. I have friends of many ethnic, religious, and whatever. But the fact that the state can punish you because you don't want to associate with someone for reason of race, sexual orientation, and I think in Canada we had motion in the parliament that if you don't call someone who is transgender by the right pronoun, you could go to jail. I mean, that's crazy. You know, if I meet someone who is a transgender and he wants me to call, look. I respect that. I'm not saying that I fully agree, but I have enough empathy for that person. I say, okay, you want me to call Madame, Mr., I'll do it. But the idea that I could go to jail if I don't do it, that's crazy. But the woke and the civic right movement, and that comes from the idea that if Nazi Germany were evil because of their racist aspect rather than me, I prefer to say their imperialist or statist aspect that every country at the time was guilty of. Right. Probably more the British Empire and the Soviet Union than Nazi Germany. So yes.
But I wanted to go back to your point though about Hitler. I mean, one of the so-called lessons of the Holocaust has been promoted in the United States very much since the 1980s, early 1980s particularly, is this huge emphasis on the Holocaust. I've written, of course, quite a lot on this. Up until 1980 or so, encyclopedias didn't even have an entry for Holocaust. Didn't
I know, and I think that
people didn't even
Churchill
talk.
doesn't mention it in his book.
Right. I mean, yeah, people knew Hitler killed Jews, but it was not in any kind of focused way during the war or for many years after the war. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because, especially in the 1980s and 90s, up until fairly recently, there's been this enormous emphasis on we have to learn the lessons of the Holocaust. Hitler's really bad, especially because he killed Jews. But behind this campaign has been this big lesson from Jewish organizations that, well, therefore we have to support Israel. That's been a big point of this. Now, the reason I bring it up is because something has changed since October 7th of last year.
Yeah.
The whole Holocaust narrative has really almost disappeared. I mean, last January was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it went by with hardly any mention. And the reason is that today, when people think about what Israel or Jews or whatever are doing, they don't think about the Holocaust. They think about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening with the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And that has changed really radically our perception, if you will, of the Holocaust, World War II, as it relates to Israel, as it relates to the whole Jewish thing. There's a iconic, well-known, familiar photograph from 1943 showing a little Jewish boy in Warsaw with his hands up, and there's a German soldier in the back with a gun. And it's been reproduced millions and millions of times. Everybody's seen it. And as sorrowful as that picture is, there are many, many pictures like that in color now that you can find similar ones in Palestine and Israel or whatever, in Gaza, of Israeli soldiers with guns, even pointing them, and little children and so forth. And so the impact of all of that has really receded. I have to keep in mind, because I'm older, that for younger people under 30, World War II is further back than World War I was for me. And so it's really a part of it's a kind of part of history in a way that was not the way we were supposed to learn about it. We're supposed to think of it in a much more immediate way. And I'm just saying that this has changed our perception a great deal of Hitler and World War II, because it's now increasing in the past. And to that extent, then there's a much more sort of willingness to look at it objectively, and I think this will change much more rapidly in the future.
But we're seeing it, as I said, since the interview with Tucker Carlson. There's been a lot about it. So yes, but people like you have been doing work on that even before the internet.
Of course, yes.
I have seen stuff from the IHR, an interview where you welcomed David Irving speaking, thing like we're on VHS, and because I downloaded them from YouTube before they got censored, so I still have them on a hard drive, and it's very. I'm not saying that I agree on everything, but mostly, and I agree with the general conclusion against the so-called good war. But I think you've done some great job, and I have a last question, but before we end, I would like that we just exchange some book reading. The last question I have is because we for people that could maybe want to accuse us of being too much of a sympathizer of the Nazi and Hitler, do you think that Nazi Germany had imperialist ambitions to conquer a part of Eastern Europe? Because I think they had. I reject the idea that Nazi Germany wanted to conquer the world. It's stupid, even I think, to believe that. I think it's clear that Nazi Germany didn't want war with the West, and I think that Hitler renounced even to advantage. I think if Hitler would have wanted to really beat the British Empire, he could have killed, I think, something like 300,000 British soldiers at Dunkirk, and he let them go in order to try to make peace. And some people will say it's a military mistake, but I think about Buchanan talk about it. And I have I read about that somewhere else. But the idea that for me, Nazi Germany was not a threat to the Western world, but I wouldn't go to say that they were, a peaceful regime. Me, I think that they had imperialist ambition to had an empire out of Central and Eastern Europe. I don't support that morally, but at the time, what they were doing was compared to was nothing new. Nobody really had. I mean, the great power like Britain, France, and the United States or the Soviet Union, they didn't have any moral or high ground to say to Hitler, "Hey, you shouldn't get an empire out of Eastern Europe because it's evil." Because they all do that. So, what do you think? If do you think it's accurate to say that Nazi Germany had imperialist ambition?
The answer I would say is yes, with qualifications. That is, yes, he had this idea that Ukraine, especially Belarus, would be part of this kind of imperium, this kind of larger thing. Having said that, though, that he expected and thought that these people would actually support this, that this would be beneficial, he thought, even for those people. And the leaders of that Germany had as allies during the Second World War were not puppets. They weren't imposed by Hitler. The leader of Romania was a real Romanian. He was chosen by Romanians. Pétain in France wasn't chosen by Hitler. The French National Assembly chose him as its leader. The leader of Hungary had been the leader before. Mussolini in Italy had already been in power before Hitler. And in Eastern Europe, the people there was especially because of the enormous hatred of the Bolshevik, of the Soviet system, there was a tremendous willingness in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine, Belarus, especially the Baltic states.
The Baltic states, a lot of people
they
joined
supported this, you see. And so the idea was, yes, it would be, and Hitler increasingly during the war, and not just Hitler, but also Goebbels, other writers talked about, basically there's be this new Europe. Now, I remember I had a talk with someone a couple of years ago in Estonia about how Estonia was during the war. I mean, for the Estonians, the German rule there was good because they turned businesses back over to private enterprise.
People didn't know that.
Oh yeah, they did all that. But he said because they would have the Estonian flag and the German flag next to each other. And he says, well, it was a little like now with the Estonian flag and the European Union flag. We're part of the European Union. We use the European Union currency. They don't have control of their own monetary policy. They don't have control. They're part of NATO. They don't have control really of their own military policy. And so Estonia and these places are sort of in a not exactly imperialist, but in a subordinate role, you might say, within this larger framework. And that's how many, as people in Estonia, Latvia, other people saw it. Because for them, they thought, well, being part of Germany and so it would be good. Their living standards would improve. They would have trade and so forth relations with these other places. People went back and forth. I don't want to overstate this, but because Hitler did have this kind of imperialistic idea. And he did this not just in a German context, but also a European one, because he was very mindful that in the future, Germany alone could not really stand on its own. It had to be part of a larger Europe, that without that, Europe would be subordinate to the United States or some other large power factor. And so that was a big factor. Now, again, it's hard to know how that would have played out if Germany had won the war. But not only German leaders, but leaders in other Axis countries or allied countries, they saw the future as a kind of confederation. They laid this out repeatedly, that after the war, there would be this confederation of states. But Hungary would still be Hungary, Finland would still be Finland, Romania would be Romania. It wasn't going to be anything like what the United States imposed, say, on its imperium in the Caribbean. The United States, allowed Cuba to be nominally independent, but basically until Castro, we decided who was going to be there. And the United States treated the Caribbean and its area basically as it's part of its sphere of influence. And the United States has done that in other countries as well. Yeah, it's imperialist. I don't think that is an improper word, but it's imperialism of a different kind. It's not imperialism of, you might say, the British or French model, in which it's over people of very, very different cultures and so forth, and they're imposing it. I mean, it had, I think, a rootedness. But anyway, that's another thing altogether. One of the ironies of the Second World War is that although Hitler expressed all this admiration before the war for the British Empire,
Yes.
In fact, he ends up and he said over and over, well, because you've declared war on us and you don't want to make any peace, we're at war with you, and your empire is going to fall apart. And during the war, Germany actually became a champion for these independence movements in India and the Arab countries against imperialism, ironically enough. And I mean, Germany was allied with the Indian independence movement led by Subhas Chandra Bose in India, and he met with Hitler. Germany supported it. It was sort of contrary to what he ever intended at the beginning, because. And so in an ironic way, during the Second World War, the British are trying to hold on to the empire, and Hitler is actually supporting these movements against British imperialism, even though that wasn't his intention at the beginning. But anyway, I think one thing we can say, it's very speculative to say what would have happened after the end of the war. But one thing is clear, what German leaders talked about, what German newspapers discussed, was some future in which there would be a confederation of some kind of the various European states, because and they began operating in that way too, to break down trade barriers between the European countries. Something like that would have happened. But also there would have been some sort of Ukrainian state. I don't think it would have been completely independent. The Germans would have made sure that whoever is there would be somebody that was acceptable to them. But having said that, it probably would have been at least certainly more independent than Ukraine was under the Soviet Union. And perhaps that's what will happen what the Americans want is a Ukraine that's going to be tied to the United States right now, for example. And they're willing to remove governments that aren't willing to go along with the United States. Anyway, yes, but the answer is yes. There was an imperialistic thing in Eastern Europe, but it's certainly not true that he had any imperialistic designs outside. He didn't want to take over.
On that I agree. I think it's clear that Buchanan made the very good point, and others that he probably militarily, I'm no expert on that. I'm not passionate about military tactic, but the fact that he renounced to capture or kill 300,000 British and French soldiers at Dunkirk because he wanted to make peace, when in fact if he had captured or killed them, probably that Churchill would have had no choice than to accept peace. I think it's important to consider.
Yes, we don't know, but we do know Hitler regarded war with Britain as completely tragic. He was just astonished, because what he couldn't understand is why Britain would actually jeopardize its own future as a country by going to a war that it couldn't possibly win without becoming a subordinate state of the United States. That's what it ended up. And in fact, many British writers have made the point, well, at the end of the war, Britain is basically dependent completely. It's bankrupt. It's business. It's ruined, its empire, and even many Brits said, well, what do we fight for? And of course, we have on our website a review of a book of essays by many British who were in World War II, and most of them are just very unhappy with what's happened to their country.
Is there a title to that book?
Yeah, it's called Forgotten Warriors, and
okay. I was
by a man named Pringle.
Yeah.
I mean, he took the trouble to ask all these people, well, what do you remember? What do you think about happened? And I find this, many people, of course, in America, they're asking the same question. Well, what did we fight for? What was the whole point? If we end up with a society as dysfunctional and as disordered and chaotic as America is increasingly seeming to be. And Tucker Carlson raised that very point in the interview with Daryl Cooper. He said, well, we were Western civilization. Whatever happened? And of course, I've dealt with that that subject as well. But all of these are very important, I think, reasons why re-examining critically the prevailing view about World War II is very important, and that's why I'm very happy to talk with you about that subject
Me,
today.
it's me. I want to interview everybody that has knowledge about it, even if they have all the perspective. In fact, I categorize all the revisionists in four category. I see there's the libertarian non-interventionist, there's the pacifist, there's the Marxist, and there are people that I consider more sympathetic to Germany and Japan, which is a freedom of opinion I respect, even if I don't fully agree. But before we end, is there? I was curious to ask about. Do you know this man, Ralph
Yes.
Raico? Okay,
Yes, I used to know him. I mean, I knew him when he was
you met
alive.
him.
Yeah, many times, several things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he died in 2016, in December 2016, and me, it was, I would say it's probably my favorite historian. It's a man I wish I had met just to shake his hand and say,
Right.
sir, you done a wonderful job. He speaks wonderfully. So you met Ralph.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
In fact, we together we went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C. together.
really? Okay.
But
'Cause,
no, I mean, yeah. Well, I'm older than you, so I knew a lot of these people back, as they say, back in the day. People say, but Ralph Raico was a very good historian, very good man. He was a libertarian. He knew Ayn Rand when he
yeah.
was a boy in New York.
Uh,
But he's written, as I have too, and as we're talking about, a lot about World War II, and he shared this basic same view about Churchill, Roosevelt, the
yeah.
role in the Second World War. I mean, the big point I think I try to make isn't trying to revive any chapter of the past. It's to try to clarify what we should learn from World War II and to disabuse people of the notion that the lesson of World War II means we're supposed to be like Superman going out fighting bad guys all over, which means is a recipe for endless war.
Yeah. Oh, I resume World War II for me was an unnecessary, unjustified war with terrible unintended consequence, a cost of destructions, and a justification for more of that evil. So I think it's a noble cause to try to put an end to it.
Yes, yes. And this is a very important point. Almost every war that I know of in modern history, certainly in modern history, turns out differently than how people expected at the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah,
That's First World War. Everyone expected at the beginning of the First World War it would be a short war, be
yeah,
over quickly,
yeah.
our side would win. Of course, it turned out, and the Second World War turned out very differently by everyone, including Germany, including Britain, including everyone. How they expected it, it turned out very differently than people expected. And of course, that's true of these modern wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. And that's one of the problems. I mean, is that wars are never, it sets in motion enormous forces that no
Oh,
one, once they start, you have no idea really how they're going to end. And that's why, as I write in my essay, war should be entered very, very cautiously, if at all. I mean, only the most extreme reason can really justify going to wars, especially wars in the modern world. You know, just one point too. Even Americans are rather ashamed of the terror mass killing bombings in World War II, not only of Germany, as you mentioned, about Hamburg and so places, but also in Japan, of course.
yeah.
And one of
Tokyo,
the
Dresden.
Dresden, so but one of the ironies is that when beginning of the Gaza war, the Israeli leaders said we're going to well, one American official said, well, you can't just treat the Palestinians and just kill them all or whatever. And he says, well, you Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said, well, that wasn't a good thing to do. And Israel is saying, well, if it was good enough for you, it's good enough for us. You see, that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And of course, many people, when I was a boy, you'd heard this, people repeated this idea a lot that, well, the reason the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan is because the Japanese are Asians and not Europeans. That's not true at all. The atomic bomb was designed to be dropped on Germany. It's only because Germany surrendered before it was ready that it was dropped on Japan. And but anyway, that's a bigger point. I mean, these are, to me, if I ever had dictatorial powers or whatever, I would try to bring about some real worldwide consensus to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Scott Horton wrote a book, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapon.
Yes.
And I think, and I heard him mentioning one time that, according to him, I am a big fan of Scott Horton, that he said that a reason why he thinks that Nazi Germany didn't develop the atomic bomb, it's because Hitler was afraid that such a weapon could inflame all the nitrogen in the atmosphere and like burn start a chain reaction on the planet. Apparently Hitler was afraid of that.
I don't know, but I do know that during the Second World War, both the United States and Germany had developed very lethal, terrible poison gases, but nobody used them because they were afraid. Each side was afraid that once they started, the destruction would be so great there would be no winners in a battle like that. These were very, very lethal, terrible gases, and
but
nobody used them.
Churchill, I would say, a time when he was drunk, which apparently was most of the time, apparently he had ordered to drop. Apparently he had ordered such an operation, but his general just disobeyed.
Yeah, well, we've put things on our website about it. He did say, "Oh, we should, yeah, why not use that? Just another weapon." And his generals all said, basically, you don't know what you're talking about. Churchill. One person said Churchill has 100 ideas a day, and maybe one or two of them are worthwhile, because Churchill was constantly thinking of these projects. Well, anyway, I don't want to get into a thing about Churchill, but the point is that in the world we live in, I think it's in the interest of the vast majority of people and governments in the world to agree to a diminution and even a elimination of nuclear weapons. And we have the technology now to make sure that all countries abide. But this can only work if the United States and the other countries actually act in that way themselves. But the problem is that American government seems to take the attitude that because we've got more nuclear weapons than anybody, we don't want to even talk about reducing or eliminating.
The United States is the dominant imperialist power right now, and that ruling class, I think they don't want to lose that position, and that's scary. So.
But, well, my big point is that on questions that involve the entire world, involve all of humanity, there needs to be cooperation, I think, between countries to carry out policies that are to the benefit of and interest of everyone. But anyway, that's a kind of utopian, maybe pipe dream or something, but it's what I would like to see.
I share that utopian pipe dream with you. Would you be interested just to suggest books? First, I would like to know, I'm sorry, are you the author of some book yourself?
I am the author of some books that have been published only in foreign languages, but I suggest that people check out our website. The website is ihr.org. There's a whole lot there, and particularly the essay that you mentioned, I've mentioned, The Good War Myth of World War II. You'll find it on our homepage on the right-hand column, along with a lot of other articles. And there is also a section of books that I recommend, and I have books on different subjects, including the Second World War.
Do you want to mention a few one?
Well, you showed one of them. It's a good primer. That's the one by Buchanan. Buchanan is not an original historian. He's a synthesizer. He's more a journalist, but he puts together a great deal that has been done. Work have been done by others. and basically is pleading for a different view of the Second and the First World War. But his book is a good introduction, I think. Another book I recommend is Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin. You might have that.
Stalin's War. Is it this one? No, I don't have it.
Well, Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, we sell that book. You can get it on the IHR store website, but that's a very good book. It's a really reassesses especially the role of the Soviet Union. It's very clear. I think historians have a large consensus almost that this idea that Stalin was just this peaceful person building up his wonderful country in 1941, and those treacherous Germans came in and wrecked everything is untrue. Stalin, the Soviet military in 1941 was by far the largest military in the world at that time. And Stalin had already attacked and taken over other countries and parts of other countries. But Sean McMeekin does a good job of putting that all together and showing the kind of, well, stupidity, if you will, of America's policy of support for Stalin without regard, really, of the nature of the Soviet regime, of what it was doing, and based on a really utopian idea about what could happen after the end of the war.
I think you also recommend this one.
Yes, this is a very good book, too. Yeah. He's more of a pacifist, you might say. But his book it traces day by day in 1940, 41, 39, with a lot of quotations. It's a very good book. Okay. Oh yeah, this is another book.
And it's from you.
That's right. This is a book.
I haven't read it, I must confess, because I bought, when I see a book on World War II revisionism, I buy it because I know maybe it will be censored, or maybe inflation will make it cost a lot more the next year. So,
well, this is a very good book on the origins of the Second World War. It's also valuable to read this book in conjunction with A.G.P. Taylor's book, The Origins of the Second World War.
Yeah, this one, which I haven't read.
Yeah, this is a good book. Again, he's actually a leftist in his views. A.J.P. Taylor was an outstanding British historian, and his focus is much more narrow than Hogan's book on the Forced War. But they're complementary, you might say. Okay, well, yes, Hitler's War, of course, is good. And Churchill's War. Now, this is probably volume 1 of Churchill's War.
Yes, I saw there's a second volume.
Yes, there's a second volume, and also a third volume is in preparation, which I'm have some knowledge about.
Okay.
But anyway, but Hitler's War. Now, again, Hitler's War is not a biography in the normal sense. It's both Churchill's War and Hitler's War sees the war from the perspective of the central character. Mm-hmm. So the disadvantage, the strength of it is it looks at it in that point of view. The downside of it is that it lacks a lot of context in a way that many people might miss.
Here I have it's book by pacifist. Those who wrote those books?
Well, I'm not familiar with this book by Grimsrud. I don't know this book.
It's a pacifist.
Okay. And this is by Edward Wood.
And it's an ex-World War II veteran that...
Well, I don't know this book, so I can't comment on that. I don't know this book.
The name of the author is
David Swanson.
Yeah.
It looks like a self-published book. Well, the point, I think one thing we can say is that as part, you might say, of a tremendous reassessment or revision that's going on in the United States about the very nature of the United States, there's a great deal of reevaluation, and a necessary reevaluation of the Second World War because of its central role in upholding the kind of self-image that the United States has had ever since the 1940s, but that's changing.
And last one.
Oh, this is a very good book. William Henry Chamberlain was for years a correspondent in Moscow. He wrote still a very good 2-volume work on the Russian Revolution. But America's Second Crusade is very lucid, well argued, sober. We sell that book as well. That's a very, very fine book. I don't know. Oh, that's a collection of essays. Yes, that's good. I forget the man who edited it and put it together, but that's a good book. It's a libertarian.
It's Richard Ebling and Jacob Hornberger, 2 libertarians.
Yes,
I would say I think they both have, I think, the same age that you are. Yes, and they have their podcast. Very interesting.
That's a good collection of essays too. Yeah. Again, the focus is much more on America and America's role, you might say, and how. But that's fine. That's fine. They're not so much interested in going into the outbreak of war in Europe and Hitler and so forth. They're more interested in America's role, which I think is a very valid way to.
Yeah, but they all have the same conclusion that it was not worth intervening, and that the unintended consequences were terrible. So
yes. I mean, well, there's much more to be said, but I'm glad you presented all these books. This is a good thing and might be useful to people watching.
Yeah, in fact, I think Scott Horton recently published the book Provoked, where he explained why how Washington provoked the war in Ukraine and all that. I bought 4 copies of the book because I want to give them to people, because right now, when you see people supporting the Ukraine just because it gives them they can feel good for a few minutes because they conform to the view of their politician, but they don't realize that maybe we could have a nuclear exchange and you could be either destroyed or you will have to live through a nuclear winter where there is no summer for 10 or 15 years, which means you will starve and freeze. So that for me, that's so. And the book Human Smoke and the book of Buchanan, I have many exemplary, and I intend this Christmas when I go to see a member of my family, I think I will offer some of my extra copy. Just if you're interested, please read that book.
Well, Human Smoke is really a startling book. The author is
easy to read.
It's easy to read. The author is very understated. He's not shouting or making a big speech. Yeah. He sort of takes the reader by the hand and says, "I want you to consider this. Consider these things," and the conclusions I think are rather obvious. But he starts with the view, war is a very bad thing, not good for, not good. And but no, that I recommend that book as well, very well. Yeah.
Is there something you want to say before we end?
No, I think we've covered things well. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. That was a pleasure. I've been listening to you for almost 20 years. I didn't know you had a kind of podcast, the Mark Weber's Review.
Yes, I do. And now I do a weekly podcast called
the thing, but it's not on iTunes or YouTube.
They used to be on YouTube, and YouTube canceled.
They censored you. I'm really sorry about that.
It used to be much better popular, but that's the world we live in. Yeah.
Okay, but I want to thank you, and I will wish you a good evening and health and success in what you will continue to do with the IHR.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you.
Okay.